the LLF 2019. I hope you've had a great time so far. There's been some very interesting sessions. Today we're joined by Lalage Snow.
Nearly.
Almost. Can you correct me?
It's Lalage.
Lalage, that's it, sorry. Who has written this fabulous book, War Gardens. Now, I'd heard about this as a bookseller when I was going to a book fair quite a while back, and I was fascinated when I just saw the concept. And I've had the good fortune to be able to read it and to, of course, share my views on the book, but predominantly in a conversation with Lalage. Lalage is essentially an award-winning photojournalist. And she graduated in 2007 from the London School of Communication and has been working in a number of flashpoints. I think it would be safe to say she specializes in maybe war and conflict, which takes a fair amount of stomach. I wanted to spend today not just talking to her about the book, but also about why she's taken this route to document a war. So first I want to welcome Lalage to the LLF, and I wanted to ask her, although I have all of the basics of how you arrived at photojournalism, but I mean, it's quite unique. You landed up as a freelance photojournalist in Afghanistan, and that's a certain amount of motivation if you're not necessarily, with secure employment. Yeah. And in your case, it was a self-funded project as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how you arrived in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, well, I knew I wanted to be a photographer from quite a young age. And in my early 20s, I spent some time in the Middle East working as a journalist on a magazine and in Bangladesh on a newspaper. And I really wanted to narrow my scope into photography. And I thought, well, how do you really throw yourself into something? You just do it. You just go there. And in about 2007, my cousin was a soldier in the British Army and was being deployed out to Afghanistan. And I decided I really wanted to go with him. And so I went out. I was deployed effectively with him for about 3 weeks. And what? Oh, apparently you can't hear me. Oh, is that better? Probably good. I was waffling, but I just threw myself into going to Afghanistan, to Helmand province, and a couple of years later, Afghanistan is a country that really gets under your skin. And a couple of years later, I went out again to photograph the Afghan National Army, not the British Army, and there discovered an extraordinary story about the first female officers to join the Afghan National Army, and I pitched it to a newspaper in England, The Telegraph. And they said, brilliant, do it. But I'd never been to Kabul before. And I thought, oh my God, where am I going? There are going to be bombs falling over the place. I arrived, and it was a beautiful sunny day in June 2010. And within a week, I had not only completed the story, I met lots of really interesting people. It wasn't at all how I'd imagined it to be. I was picking up lots of work, and it just seemed like a natural place to stay. And so I did for 5 years.
So I think you embark on what is something of a love affair with Afghanistan. I mean, you have a deep affection for the land, despite the turmoil that it has undergone, and the history, which you do also talk about. But you've, before I go on about that, I do want to, however, just set out, the book is actually covers 3 flashpoints. So it would be Afghanistan, which is where Ms. Snow spent the most of her time, Israel and the occupied territories, Ukraine, and essentially the purpose of gardens in these very, very violent and, I guess, desperate regions of the world. So coming back to Afghanistan, you had a rather sort of interesting experience in that you settled upon the garden as a way of basically looking at Afghanistan. And there were various aspects that became a part of your discovery, from the relationship with the land to the notorious cultivation of poppies. So could you just take us through that journey of Afghanistan through the gardens that you saw and what it really what it brought to the fore for you?
Well, I think what's important to understand is how photographing gardens first came about, and it was really as I became rather apathetic and war-weary, and there are only so many disastrous, chaotic, horrible things that you can see before you become quite inured and numb to it. And war photography, I just realized that it was in 2012, it sort of was ceasing to mean anything. You know, we're so surrounded by images of conflict and war and chaos that it doesn't, you know, it was ceasing to have any effect on me, and I thought, well, on audiences at home. So I decided to choose the absolute opposite to war, which is gardens. And Afghanistan, as probably most of you know, has a huge history and love affair with gardens at the same time. And I started with Bagi Babur, the Emperor's Garden, Babur's Garden in Kabul, and then from there found other people through friends, through contacts, through fixers. And each garden was so unique in its own way, and I only talk about a handful here. I mean, in reality, I sort of interviewed, I think, over 150 gardeners in total. And they all kind of encapsulated so many elements of not only just Afghan culture, Afghanistan and Asian culture and history, but also what it means to be human. So from the chap on the front cover, Mohammed Kabir, who was gardening in the old Darulaman Palace, which is on the outskirts of Kabul, and stands as a kind of a testimony to the ruined country of Afghanistan, to the former mayor of Kabul, who spent a lot of time in America, whose wife used to bring seeds back from Virginia, to, I'm trying to think, there are so many, to a young guy called Hamidullah, who was a pharmacology student who really wanted to flee the country to go to Germany, but was torn between staying in his homeland, having been brought up as a refugee in Iran, and also being afraid for his own life. So it really was a journey over 7 years, it was, through so many different elements of Afghanistan and humanity.
So there is a very characteristic love for the land in Afghanistan, which comes out in the first section of the book when you speak about Kabul. But it's a theme that carries through the entire book when you talk about Gaza, when you talk about the kibbutz in Israel, when you talk about Ukraine. This idea of land forming an identity, how deeply entrenched was it in Afghanistan?
Oh, hugely. I mean, sort of gardening and breathing and go hand in hand with being Afghan. And the idea of, I mean, I interviewed some Talibs in the Helmand province, and we spoke about the motivation for fighting against the British and the American, for the international troops. And it really was the invasion of land for so many of them. And some of them were, localized Taliban. They were from the village and decided to fight because I think one guy, Mirwais Khan, said, they came and they didn't ask for permission. They invaded my land. What would you do? And I struggled to find an answer. If some foreigners started trampling over my garden, I'd be rather irritated and probably want to fight against them too. So yeah, it is deeply entrenched. And in other countries too, in Israel, Gaza, land is the war. It is what people fight about. It's what they die for. But it's also a spiritual thing as well. It's, as you were saying earlier, it's the mythology of land and connection. It's the religious identity for both sides, which is incredibly frustrating to cover as a correspondent.
And war essentially it's a fight over land. It's a fight over real estate in many ways. And I think I'm going to jump forward a little bit to another flashpoint, and I think that's best conveyed with respect to the occupation and what are the current conditions in place in Gaza. That you have an open-air prison of a very small footprint, which has a huge population where the land is physically running out. Yeah. It's interesting to see how the relationship with the land is torn apart, and then just purely by the spirit of striving and resistance, people put that back together. Could you tell me how you saw that in Gaza? That's how I felt when I read.
Gaza is, it's, as you say, it's a very small country, and it's a population of, I think, just under 2 million people, and it's effectively an open-air prison where conditions are very poor. There's very little water. There are power shortages all the time. But the Gazans are really resilient, and it's an incredible thing to see and to bear witness to. And so many of them are using the means of gardening and agriculture as a means of defiance. So there was a chap that I met called Abu Awad, who uses a hydroponic system of gardening on the 13th floor of his of apartment building. And it's extraordinary. It's a space about as big as sort of this squared, using plumbing pipes and fish waste and stones instead of soil, because there is no soil for him to use. And he manages to feed his extensive family and neighbours, and it's an extraordinary symbol of defiance that is it's incredibly powerful.
And it's also that focus and ingenuity that you will exist, you will continue, even if the land shrinks. So it's a unique way of being able to sustain your family, to go through the meditative process of growing something, even though you lack the land.
Well, absolutely. In fact, it's almost more than that. There was a lady called Zlaika who I interviewed in Hebron, which is similar to Gaza. It's under semi-apartheid and very locked down. If you're Palestinian, it's very hard to move around. And Zlaika lived on a road that had been basically blockaded for any Palestinians, and only Jews were allowed to travel down it. So she had no access to her front door, and her balcony overlooked this main road. But it had been caged in, and I thought she'd caged in, and I thought someone else had caged her in, but it was actually herself. But she wanted to continue to garden on this balcony because she said gardening is a means of showing that we still exist, which is incredibly kind of potent, I think.
And I think it's lovely to be able to maybe respect and, unfortunately, in some cases, fetishize that ability to strive. But the reality is, and it comes across very much with Gaza and also with Ukraine, is the mental strain on the people who live in these spaces. Yeah. I mean, like, there's a litany of conditions that the young children are suffering in Gaza, but then the garden has a role to play. And can you tell us a little bit about how you saw that in Gaza and maybe even throughout the rest of the occupied territories and Ukraine, what it did to help heal?
Well, I think gardening is a means, and I have to say I'm not a gardener. I'm a really terrible gardener, and I kill on site. But I have understood through the people that I've interviewed that gardening is incredibly therapeutic because it connects you to nature, and your hands in the soil somehow it roots you physically and mentally. And I think there's a nutrient in the soil which apparently has an effect on your endorphins. So I think that I met children in Gaza there was a 17-year-old girl who she loved being in her garden because it was freedom. And up on the rooftop garden, she felt free. And all her dreams, she said, were contained by the occupiers, Israel. But up in the garden, she felt that she could be her own person. And similarly in Ukraine with young children, it's so devastating to see when people have had everything taken away from them, and it came out of nowhere, that conflict. And similarly, the gardens kind of rooted people back to their sort of traditional way of being. And Ukrainians are sort of born with their hands in the soil, a very agricultural country, but with the collapse of communism and the rise of capitalism, a lot of people had forgotten the old ways and become reliant on supermarkets instead of actually growing. And suddenly the war started and loads of shops started closing, and imports from Russia or China they stopped. And so people thought, well, hang on a sec, how do we feed ourselves? Oh, we have to go back to our old ways. And people were growing tomatoes and lettuces and potatoes and okra, and also as a microeconomy in order to sell to other people at the side of the road, which was,
Yeah. So it was almost like in the face of war, people were organizing themselves on a more traditional foundation of subsistence farming.
Yeah, but I think it's more than that. It's about taking control over something when everything around you is beyond your control. I think that's particularly pertinent in Gaza and in the West Bank if you're Palestinian, and particularly pertinent in Ukraine, where there's this chaos around you. You don't know, and there's a live war going on, and you don't know what's happening from this day to the other. but you do know that your garden needs to be watered, and you've got seeds that might need replanting or propagating, and soil that needs help to aerate or fertilize.
Yeah. There's an interesting, again, coming back to the idea of tradition, there's an interesting realization, I guess, that I felt came across in the book, that people understood that the human connection with land was essentially how they would survive. And you have the Ukrainian families going back to dacha gardens, is that right? So it was sort of like a cross between a kitchen and a subsistence farming arrangement.
Yeah.
So you're essentially able to live and thrive on your own ability to grow. And that it was such a part of the Ukrainian identity.
But it had, like I said, it had been forgotten because, rise of, cheap imports coming in from neighbouring countries. Returning to that was very much that's what people were doing. They were returning to that dacha style.
So markets and demand also determine how people cultivate the land. I mean, we could romanticize the subsistence farming and being able to take control. But in Afghanistan, you had a narco economy sustained by poppy cultivation.
Yeah.
So how did you sort of reconcile yourself with that in a place of where it should be easy to find a right and a wrong position?
Yeah. It was tricky actually because a lot of my friends have been soldiers, and a lot of my friends have been killed as soldiers, so it was quite difficult to go and interview people who are actively cultivating the poppy. But then, speaking to people, you go in with an open mind and you speak to local farmers and you realize that pretty much everyone in Helmand province is involved in the opium trade and growing poppies, even though it's illegal. And sorry, small child scream. But you sort of think, well, if you're growing the opium, you get a much higher yield of crop, and you're trying to feed your family of maybe 20, 25 people. And, if there might be some aid project that says, oh, you should grow watermelons instead. But if poppy gives you a 300% increase of what you're going to earn, then of course you're going to do that for 2 weeks of the year. Of course you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But morally it was quite a challenge. But then you start speaking to people and, you understand other people's perspectives. And you think, well, okay, what would I do if I was in that situation?
Yes. You speak of a family that was making $400 over a period of 6 months. That's just a criminally low amount you can barely survive on. And I think you found it difficult to romanticize the adherence to not growing poppy when you see the destitution and the complete desperation that they're looking at.
Yeah, this man was trying to feed a family he had 7 children, and he was earning $400 over a period of 6 months. And it's quite hard and one of his children was really ill. So it's very hard to kind of frown upon someone who just tries to do well by their family, just because in the West we say, oh, well, opium farming is really bad. I'm not advocating it, but it's a question that you always ask yourself.
I think it was also very interesting that you commented on the ill-advised, half-baked kind of development projects that attempted to steer people away from poppy cultivation to growing, more to encourage subsistence farming or staple crops or anything other than poppies. And could you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, in Afghanistan there are many development projects that are funded by the British, the Americans, the French, and so many of them are thought up by sort of think tank people in a room very far from where things are actually taking place, very far from Afghanistan. And to that end, so many of the projects that have been sort of started and then forgotten have just completely, a complete waste of money. There was one instance where they were trying to give the Helmandis seeds to grow wheat. Well, of course, as I've said, the opium is much more lucrative as a crop, but often the seeds weren't checked properly and they'd been switched for grass seeds, or people realized that if they brought them over the border to Quetta, they'd actually be able to sell the seeds that were given to them. So there was no accountability of what happened. But even worse, there was an idea to build some fridges in
Yes.
Gereshk, in Helmand, I think for ice or for ice cream. But no one had thought it through that there wasn't enough power to power these enormous fridge vans, and so they just sort of sat there, empty. And in fact, I was talking to someone the other day, completely about purposes, and they mentioned these extraordinary fridges that are still sitting in Gereshk, empty, and I think they're being used as, I don't know, offices by the Taliban or something. So, completely ludicrous projects that are thought up.
So, when you hear these stories, it almost seems like, well, the whole Afghan experiment was fated to fail, and that it was probably better off not to have gone in. Do you have any feelings, having been there towards maybe, I would say, the closing period of the war, that what was it all for?
Well, yes, I think about that often. I don't know what it was all for. It still rumbles on. People are still dying every day, and there are attacks every day, and the Taliban has taken back control of most of the country, I believe. I think Afghanistan also faces a twofold thing. Not only is it ongoing conflict, it's also having been through so much conflict in previous decades, it's facing this sort of development issue. So you've got the conflict on one side, and you've got this developing country on the other side. So I think the two things have sit at odds with each other. In terms of development context, there have been gains. There are more women have been empowered, if you can look at that as being a specific gain. In Kabul city, the roads are, paved, and I saw that over the course of my time living there. More people are in school, but is it going to last? Who knows? And I can't tell you if I don't know what it was all for sometimes.
I believe they also have the menace of pollution, because there was a couple of gardeners who were complaining how the pollution affected their plants.
Yes, completely. But it's a low city. Well, it's a high city, but it's surrounded by mountains. So if you imagine the pollution sits at a haze, a sort of a permanent haze, especially in the winter when there's smoke from the wood burning stoves. So
there's a lot of damage that you see modern living exacting on these gardens. And I think one of the interesting things was that there was a desire, even in sort of the Israeli part, in Israel, where you were I think in parts of the West Bank, where there had been seed banks that were set up. There was a botanical garden who, in the face of modern agriculture, felt that, well, we have to do gardening the way it was traditionally done, and for that.
Well, I think it was also in the West Bank. I think there were lots of permaculture. People were returning to permaculture. Permaculture is a way of sort of having an ecosystem within your garden. So you use the methane that might come from some leaves that have been rotted by the sun through some glass that then provides gas. That yada yada yada. People were there was one permaculture farm that they were completely subsistent, and they were producing vast quantities of vegetables and fruits. And the only thing they needed from Israel, and this is key, were bees to pollinate the vegetables inside these big greenhouses. And I say it's key because that was their defiance against the occupation. And the family that run this permaculture, they'd been completely, the poor guy was such a lovely guy. He'd been arrested, beaten. He was buried up to his neck with Israeli soldiers threatening to roll over his head until his wife intervened. So he really had a personal, and his permaculture farm is right on it's next to the wall, the security barrier. So he really, it was defiance was part of his very fabric. But it was the only thing that he needed were bees, and that was kind of, it's defiance.
So it was interesting. There's a psychological warfare that is taking place in the occupied territories, where with Gaza there was a thriving, I believe, a flour export business, which after the blockade was completely wiped out. And then there was the story of a young lad who wanted to set up a mushroom growing facility.
That was in the West Bank, just outside Jericho. He was a young sort of entrepreneur, and he used to be in tech, and he decided one day that he wanted to do mushroom imports. not import mushrooms, but grow mushrooms, because in the trendy restaurants in Ramallah, all the mushrooms that were being used were from Israel. And he thought, well, no, I'm going to grow my own, and we Palestinians can work together to grow our own mushrooms and feed ourselves. And he gave a lovely quote, which I'm afraid memory escapes me what exactly it was, but it was about growing being part of culture and your identity. And unfortunately, he needed, it was compost from the Netherlands. And because he was becoming a bit of a threat to the Israeli competitors, the compost that he was going to import was then stuck at Sderot port for 2 months. And after 2 months, the compost then becomes completely unusable. But he had to pay to have it released, which he couldn't afford. And then if he didn't get it released, he was fined. So either way, he was completely
bankrupted.
Bankrupted,
Yeah.
exactly, from basically becoming a credible competitor to the Israeli mushroom growers.
And there's a rather sort of a poignant image of him standing with these empty shelves, which should have been covered in mushrooms.
Yeah, and it's inside this, it was a very high-tech mushroom growing kind of, not a factory, it was a sort of big room. It's probably about as big as this, actually. And these lovely sort of, state-of-the-art technology, growing shelves with acclimatized digital air conditioning coming in all over the place, and everything was empty. And the thing about mushrooms is they grow very, very quickly, and that was why it was a really good business for him to sort of try and start up. But it didn't work because of the occupation.
It sounded classically Catch-22 when you saw how it turned out for him.
Yeah.
But that seems to me to be the psychological warfare, where you take out a key component and the entire enterprise that a Palestinian is striving for collapses.
Yeah.
And it seems to translate a lot when it comes to, in this case, compost, but the provision of water in Gaza and fertilizer. These were the two things that prevented them from being able to...
Well, water's a huge thing, and I think I haven't been reading anything recently, but I know certainly last year that the water shortages in Gaza were so tight, there was so little water, that people were being rationed. And that's just for daily drinking water. So trying to grow. And a lot of the water comes straight through from Israel. And on the Israeli border, there are lots of farms and rural areas and crops and people growing fruits and flowers and trees for export to Europe and America. And a lot of the water that comes through to Gaza is basically wastewater. And it's useless, which is really sad.
I believe there's also the sewage is a problem in the West Bank as well, where the infrastructure is completely non-existent. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the culture of kibbutz in Israel, because that was very interesting. I mean, I grew up in England, and I had classmates who had worked on kibbutz and things like that, and that was a while back. So there was a certain culture and ethos behind the idea of a kibbutz. Could you just, maybe for those who don't know what a kibbutz is, talk about what it is and where the foundational idea came from and where it is now after the modern, sort of like in the modern day and age?
Well, the kibbutz is a foundation of sort of original Zionism, where they were set up by Eastern Europeans fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. And the idea was that basically you become part of a collective, you become part of a village, and you almost give up your identity to become part of the kibbutz. You almost become part of a tribe, an extended family. And back in the day, in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, pictures of the kibbutzim that were set up were very basic. And they were, I suppose they were the original settlers. But it was on a socialist model rather than a religious model. So as part of the kibbutz, you would be given a job every month or every 2 months or every year. And whether that's working in the factory, working in the fields, working in the school, working as a doctor, everyone mucked in and you were all equal together. As time goes on, socialism sort of dwindled, or it's changing now, but it dwindled, and the rise again, similarly, of consumerism has completely changed the fabric of the kibbutz. So it's quite hard. Every kibbutz is different. And imagine going to, I suppose, it's like you say, every village is different. But in some really have retained their religious identity and have become more religious, and some are much more consumer orientated. So there's one I forget the name of the kibbutz on the Dead Sea, and it's basically a tourist trap, and they own a petrol station, and you go to the petrol station, it's full of rather overweight tourists buying sun cream and mud from the Dead Sea, and that all goes back into funding the kibbutz. But there's little cohesive identity. There are people in the kibbutz, and some of the people I interviewed there, they don't know their neighbors, which is completely counter the kibbutz, the model of the kibbutz, where you know everyone and you're friends with everyone, and it has completely changed over time, as has this living off the land, which is the kibbutz were always tied to the land, and you'd live off the land, and you know what you grew, you then farmed, and it went back into making bread. And now it's completely different, and much like Ukrainians have struggled with losing supermarkets. The rise of supermarkets. Similarly, in the kibbutz, contemporary life, capitalism, whatever you like to call it, has taken over. It's changed.
So I appreciated that a lot of the chapters, this is probably going to go more into the style of writing, open with a quote from, in some case, a philosopher, a literary figure, a children's author. I thought that was kind of an interesting choice. I mean, I thought it was very appropriate that you opened with Voltaire and the idea that we must garden, we must cultivate. So could you just tell me why you decided to do that? Because you even use Frances Hodge Burnett and The Secret Garden.
Yeah.
And then somewhere in it, which I really appreciated, was you referenced Evelyn Waugh's William Booth.
Yeah.
Which is one of my favorite characters from a book called Scoop. And every journalist that comes from anywhere has usually have read it. But you do that, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. So was that to add another element to the book?
I think I wasn't particularly conscious of it. I think it was probably to make it... I think when you say gardens and war, maybe people think, I don't understand the concept. So maybe it's the idea that gardening is all around us, and it doesn't matter if it's Voltaire or a children's book. Gardening is... nature is around us. But I love books and I love reading, so I think it was possibly an organic choice.
Yeah.
And William Booth, yes, someone accused me of being William Booth, which I found hilarious.
But I did appreciate it was slipped in there. Read Scoop if you don't get the reference. Again, I want to talk about the layers of the book. When I was reading it, I wasn't reading it like a gardener. I'm not a gardener. And I was a little intimidated by the Latin phrases for certain flora. And I realized quite quickly that it didn't really matter if you're not familiar about gardening. And yet you mentioned earlier to me that many people buy the book as a book on gardening. So the appeal of this book.
Well, I would hope the appeal is sort of very wide, from anyone who likes gardens to anyone who likes or is interested in counter-narratives or war reporting, and also a bit of travel as well. I'm not a gardener, as I said, and in fact, throughout the entire process, my brother is a garden designer, and I had to photograph the garden. Well, I did photograph the flowers all the time, but I had to send him the flowers for identification purposes. So it's not, I think, it's a way, gardening in war zones is a way of looking at conflict through something counterintuitive and offering a counter-narrative to these countries are terrible, look at the news, it's chaos. It's actually like, well, it is, but look at the people who are trying to live there, who are just like you and me, just like everyone in this room, who are just trying to live a peaceful life in an extraordinary circumstance.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to the audience in a little while to take some questions. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the cover of the book, because it does provide a backbone. It features in the beginning half of the book, and then it comes full circle where you meet Kabir again. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey of who by 2017 should have been 110, Kabir?
Well, he was one of the first gardeners I met in Kabul. And the palace that's behind him was one of my favorite places in the city. It was a ruined palace, ruined in the Civil War. And it was an incredibly peaceful place to go because it was on a hill overlooking the city, and the wind used to whistle through, and it was pretty deserted, and you could sort of wander around, kind of, if you bribed the soldiers who were working there, you could wander around on your own and just have a bit of peace and quiet. Anyway, a friend of mine went there one day, and she said, and she knew I was looking for gardens, and she said, there's a guy growing in the courtyard. And I didn't believe it. So I went to speak to him, and lo and behold, there he was. And he was employed by the Afghan army who were based there to provide a kitchen garden for them. Because unlike the British and the Americans, the Afghans live off the land as soldiers. And he decided to make his own flower garden, and he brought his seeds from his home, and he was growing, it's a very messy garden, don't get me wrong, but he was growing all sorts of things, like sunflowers and geraniums, and roses, and there was a maize plant, and he had these wonderful, fanciful stories, and he told me that he was 105 years old, and that gardening kept him young. And I questioned, I was like, are you sure? And with my translator and friend, I was like, are you sure about this? And he said, no, he didn't change his story once, he's definitely 105. And then cut to sort of 7 years later, and I went back to meet him, and I was making a documentary for the BBC about the gardeners of Kabul. And I went to meet him, and they're actually rebuilding the palace, so his garden had been completely destroyed. But we went, and he was still gardening there, and he had this enormous greenhouse, about as long as this room, and it was just absolutely full of Judas plants, the very spiky ones, and roses, and yellow trumpet flowers. And it was in the middle of winter when I went to meet him, and it was freezing cold and like bitter Kabul winter, and sort of your hands are kind of ice blocks. And then we went into this greenhouse, and it was just so fragrant. It was like there was a spring inside. It was always spring inside his greenhouse, and it was such a. And he was very upset that his garden had been destroyed, but it was such a joy personally to find that. All right, brilliant. The palace is being developed, the palace is being rebuilt, retaining a bit of cultural heritage, but so is Kabir. He's still gardening, and he's creating this perma-spring season inside his greenhouse.
It's a lovely sort of like way to sort of bring it full circle. So I think it was quite hopeful, like that. I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Is there anything you'd like to ask Lalage? Is that right? Lalage. Sorry. I'll get there eventually. Are there any questions that you'd like to put forward? Don't be shy. Go ahead.
Hello. I am Faizan from The Nation newspaper. Welcome to Lahore, and I just came to know about your book, and it's a very interesting, as well as I feel these are those topics which are very undermined during wars and conflict. I just want to ask, as you talk about the Palestinians responding to Israelis, the atrocities through these gardenings, these gardens sessions. So I just want to ask, how do you see the responding of Palestinians through a very noble way by these gardens, by highlighting these gardens in the time of conflicts and war? So how do you compare the response of Palestinians towards Israelis through as you highlighted the war gardens in the time of conflicts and in the time of wars? These gardens are those calm places which are responding to these conflicts. So how do you see this?
I couldn't quite, the echo is really loud.
I think it was basically what was the response of both parts of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, both parts of a conflict when they see this cultivation going on and the beauty of gardens in their various areas. So
I think the thing to understand is that on both sides, in Gaza more so than in the West Bank, Gaza wasn't always like this, and it used to be a really free crossing. It was free reign, and Israelis used to go into Gaza, and Palestinians used to go into Israel. And so often when I was chatting to people in the kibbutz along the border, they would sort of say rather wistfully, "Oh, how are they doing? No, I used to go there all the time with my kids. We used to go and hang out at this lovely fish restaurant on the beach. We used to go and buy hummus from the markets." And there was a real sense of no one really wanted the conflict at all. And it was, both sides felt really trapped by this sort of stalemate between Hamas and the government. In the West Bank, it was slightly different because it's much closer. And the settlements and the villages that are being destroyed. But the show of force on the side of the settlers is really brutal, and there was very little love that went on there at all. Very little.
Is there any contact that you saw between the Israelis and Palestinians?
Definitely. Well, Jerusalem is well, it's divided in two, but I mean, it's not an apartheid. There was a chap that I interviewed who was a bonsai specialist in the botanical gardens in Jerusalem, and he really wanted to work with olive trees that had been torn up from settlers in settlements around the country to recreate something beautiful out of these really ancient trees. Some of them are 3,000 years old. And I think that was, I hope he's doing it now, it was a couple of years ago, and that was something that I thought was a real sign of hope and of also open-mindedness. And he was he's a Jewish Israeli, but he really wanted to extend the metaphorical olive branch to I guess, to everyone involved in the conflict and say, look, stop, let's create something beautiful out of what you're trying to destroy.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask one of my own. There's a person that when you read the book, that you will become familiar with, and I found her quite fascinating, Zara. She's she's an Israeli-Palestinian.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is she does what is, I think, what's colloquially called as code switching.
Yeah.
Quite a bit in order to survive. That was a unique survival skill, and did it leave an impact on you to see her?
Hugely. So she's a Palestinian Israeli, and she worked on both sides of the conflict as a journalist and with journalists, and she was a similar age to me, and she didn't want to work with me because I had no money, but in the end I begged her, and we came to an agreement that we did a few days, and then I helped her with something. But she spoke fluent Hebrew and obviously fluent Arabic, and in her car, she would, at any one time of going into settlements, she would either hang prayer beads or I forget what it is, there's a Hebrew prayer, I think, that people put in their cars. So depending on where we were in Israel, she would switch. And then she said, I could pass for an Ashkenazi Jew. And she'd go from being, salam alaikum to being shalom and being very, flirting with the IDF soldiers, so we go into a settlement. And it was an extraordinary thing to see. And she's not actually called Zara. She didn't want to be referred to because I think she herself has, on email, she said, I still am conflicted with my own identity. But she's an amazing girl, really amazing.
Yeah, but when you say she was conflicted about her own identity, in what way? Because I can't see you escaping that when you code switch that much.
Because she really hated, and she doesn't work in Palestine anymore, she really hated the conflict, and she said she'd been there for too long. She was brought up in America as well, and she said she'd been there for too long, and she hated the conflict. And she hated what each side was doing to each other, but she felt part of both sides. So she had this internal conflict.
Yeah. Any other questions? So tell me a little bit about the reception that the book has got, and how the documentary War Gardens, the reception you got for that as well. How is it? How have you? What are the kind of thoughts and feelings that people have shared with you after having read the book?
Well,
or seen the documentary?
It's fortunately it's had very good reviews in England by some great publications. I think the reception for the most part has been complete surprise because it's such an unusual thing to focus on at the same time as conflict. And then people who have read it have been really touched by the personalities that have come out, because some people use gardening as a means of therapy when they've lost a child, or a sister or a parent. Some see it as a symbol of defiance. Some people see it as a symbol of hope and prosperity, or a return to traditional ways. And I'm guaranteed that within each and every one of you in this room will be able to identify with a gardener, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We can all somehow find common ground and empathy to identify with each other. And I think that's the key that I've certainly learned through doing this, is that we all effectively want the same thing. We just want to have a peaceful life and to live calmly, and all this chaos that happens around us is just rather annoying, really.
Yeah. Are you able, or perhaps even tempted, to do launch events in the flashpoint areas that you cover? I mean, maybe it would be difficult in the Ukraine, I don't know, but do you
I'd love
feel...
to. No, I'd love to. I just have no clue of how to go about doing it.
You don't feel that maybe the Palestinian Lit Pal Fest would maybe invite you to talk about it. Have
I
you
shall
thought?
email them immediately.
Yeah, I think that would be my suggestion to you, and because I think it would be really interesting to see the reception of people who you have tried to sort of represent their stories through this book. So I think that would be something that, as a suggestion on my part. I think that is that time we've got. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. And any other questions out there? Okay, quiet audience. So how have you enjoyed your time in Lahore so far? This is your first time, I'm assuming?
It is, and I didn't realize that Lahore is the city of gardens. It was my wake up this morning. I thought, oh my God. But unfortunately, I have a baby who's rather distracting and won't let me do anything that I really want to do, like go to the garden.
But actually, that reminds me, because there was one thing I wanted to talk about was the Bagh Babar.
Yes, yeah.
Which obviously is it's shared heritage with us as well, and the fact that the Bagh Babar was destroyed, but there was a desire to give the Afghani people their history back in the form of the garden and the final resting place of Babur.
Yeah.
So how, it's a bit of a leading question, how successful was that restoration?
Well, very successful. The garden was destroyed over the years, not because of the war, just because of going into a state of disrepair in the I think in the early 20th century, and then just fell into rack and ruin. And then during the Civil War, it was on the front line between various factions of the Mujahideen, and it was completely destroyed. And the Aga Khan Foundation rebuilt it in 2005, I believe, 2005. And now it's a very stunning, beautiful place in Kabul to go and escape, and Afghans love going there as well, because it's you can go there and picnic with your families under these beautiful trees and next to these water channels and water fountains. But I think the most successful thing about the garden is not just the aesthetic restoration, but what it is to give cultural heritage back to people when the country's been destroyed. And Afghanistan is still sort of paddling on water like a duck, trying to re-establish itself. And it was a modern country, modern city Kabul was before the conflict happened. And I think the restoration of the garden as a psychological rebuilding of a country is really important. And if you think about all the key heritage sites of Pakistan or of England and what they mean to identity, they appear on banknotes, they appear on stamps. It's so important to have that pride in your country. And that's what the restoration projects do.
I'd actually marked it on my notes first. I can't believe I missed it until this point. But it struck me because it cost just 5 million. If you think of all the development projects that take place, 5 million,
nothing
over 10 years. Only the Aga Khan could do that. I mean, it made me feel very proud that that we even have that association with somebody who has been able to restore so much of our heritage.
Yeah.
And has then, sort of divested a similar sort of gift in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah.
So I thought it was something I really wanted to
and
focus
so many
on.
of the Afghan gardeners that I spoke to, they were very, very poor. Would sort of say, what would a lot of them were retired gardeners who worked for organisations, and so often you'd sort of say, well, what would be your ideal job? And they'd say, I would like to work at Baba's garden, which was really lovely. And in fact, we took some there as a sort of a gift, which was nice.
So there were, let me get this right, 5,500 species that had been collected for that garden?
I believe so, yeah.
And I picked up that Afghanistan has remarkable soil.
Depending on where you are, yeah.
Yeah, because I think the gentleman behind the Bagh Babar project said that the soil in Afghanistan, or maybe it was specific to Kabul, was extraordinary. You could grow anything.
Yeah. I mean, he said that rather sort of, perhaps it was metaphorically, but he again, like me, had a bit of a love affair with the country, and he'd been there a lot longer than I had. But he said it's a remarkable place for growing things. But you go outside Kabul into the hills around LLF, and you see dog roses growing everywhere, and tulips and all sorts of lovely things that you'd only dream of in England, where we're so crazy about gardens and sort of cultivating and making everything ornamental. And then you go to the wild hills of just outside Kabul, and you're like, it's there. It's extraordinary. But the chap who was the chief horticulturalist, he he sped off on a motorbike just when the restoration began and travelled the length and breadth of the country picking up seeds so that the garden of Kabul, the Baghi Babur, became this representation of the entire country in one garden.
There was a rather interesting about the garden. Sorry, I've just drawn a blank for a moment. It was not just the ability for the garden to grow, it was people's response to it in terms of space. I mean, there was so much insecurity, and then you had a public space that had been gifted back to a population.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the place that public spaces and gardens have in a nation, I mean, is that something that was the reason why Baghi Babur was reconstructed? Because you had to essentially help restore some, I guess, sanity or
Perhaps.
normalcy.
Yeah, perhaps. I think it's more to do with cultural heritage, but perhaps because when you're living in a state of conflict, you're pretty much inside. So perhaps mentally as well as physically, you're hiding. Look at people in Syria or in Ukraine, where people living in their bunkers or cellars. So perhaps it was a way of getting people to go outside and to engage, I suppose, with the world outside and not be afraid. But yeah,
When was the last time you went back to Afghanistan?
2017.
So that would be the last chapter of the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
And the documentary on war gardens, which is specifically the Afghanistan
Yeah.
portion, that was aired this year,
That was aired last year.
and you can see it on BBC?
You can, and you can see it on wargardens.org
Okay,
as well.
all right.
Yeah.
So, are we... Yes. Yes.
First of all, I really... Hello?
We've got
Hello?
two questions now.
I really appreciate your efforts.
Hello. I'm so sorry, I can't.
Do they know the bad effects of poppy cultivation?
Oh, yes. Do they know the bad effects?
This, you can say, in poppy items, different kind of production of poppy items.
Yes, and in fact, I interviewed Talib Mullah, who was involved in the poppy cultivation. I interviewed a young lad who was involved in harvesting, and both times I said, well, obviously, like growing poppy is haram, and they both said it's not because they provide money for war. He said specifically jihad, jihad meaning war against anyone invading. War against the invaders. So yes, they knew about it. And then the young guy said, he was 14 or 15 years old, and I said, have you ever tried it? And he said, no, and I don't want to. My friend has tried it, and I quote, he said, he's now so skinny he can't work and he smells really bad. So they know about it. And they're also now, there's a big public information campaign, and there has been for the last 17 years, with huge billboards about the effects of the poppy. But sadly, it's still very prevalent. And I think it's on the rise, but it's mostly, 80% of the world's opium is exported from Afghanistan.
We have a question right next to you.
First of all, thank you very much. I worked many years in Afghanistan, and when I saw this book, it reminded me of two things. One was, you may know the house of the French archaeologists in Kabul, next to the NATO headquarters.
Yeah.
And one afternoon, I was sitting there, and there was, in 2007, the air is full of helicopters. There's some blast somewhere far, and it's like around March. But there was this old man watering this one rose, as if he's making love to it. He's spending so much time looking. And in the 20 minutes I just looked at him, the war just stopped around me. So I saw that. And then I also remembered this You know Michaud and Michaud, the two French photographers who do a lot of work in Afghanistan?
No, I don't know.
You've got to see this. I wish we had a projector. There's an old man, looks like your old man, like the old,
Yeah.
the Pashto man, and he has a rose in his hand.
Oh, there you go.
And it says, the Afghan rose, saddler in the bazaar Tashqorghan, occasionally interrupts his work to breed a rose with infinite delicacy. And so there is a love affair between old men and roses.
Yeah.
And this goes back to our tradition of miniatures and all of that. So, I mean, I want to, have you noticed that love affair? and actually, the serious question was, did they also understand the therapeutic effect of working with soil themselves as trauma? I missed the beginning of your talk. Maybe you talked about that. But is this something that they themselves were aware of it, or is this something that came from their tradition and,
I think a bit of both. I mean, there were over 100 gardeners in the book, and some of them it's a very conscious decision to garden and to have your hands in the soil. And some, it was only on me asking a question, how do you feel when you garden? Does it come out, I feel very at peace? And there's, a couple of people would refuse to talk to me because they'd say, I don't want to talk about the conflict, you're a journalist, yada, yada, yada. And I'd say, well, I don't want to talk about the conflict, I want to talk about your garden. And suddenly this new personality would emerge, oh, my garden, oh, come in, come this way. So it was remarkable. And then through that, you have a narrative of the conflict through their garden. But in terms of what you were saying about being peaceful, in fact, yesterday I was very, very, very stressed because I'd had no sleep and my luggage went missing along with my buggy for my baby. And when it arrived, it was broken. And I was in my hotel talking to my husband on the phone, cursing everyone under the sun. And I found myself in the hotel garden nursery, quite by accident. And it immediately relaxed me. And it was just, it's still spring and early spring here, but I suddenly saw these quite familiar flowers from Afghanistan, like some of the dog roses and the Judas trees. And it completely took away all of my anger and frustration just by kind of, in the early evening sun, this beautiful patch of, propagation happening. So and I'm not a gardener, so everyone go and garden. Yeah, it's a physical thing. Am I? Are they? Well, yes, they should be. And in fact, I think there are more and more, especially in different countries. I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of initiatives to help soldiers with traumatic issues, PTSD, to help them cope with, whether it's from Afghanistan or Iraq or the Falklands or Ireland. And there are lots of gardening initiatives. There are lots of things being set in place, but they're very small at the moment. So hopefully they'll spread through word of mouth and they'll propagate.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to end. This was one thing that you had in the book that that really struck a chord with me. There was a Ukrainian man who said that it was very necessary for people to garden in Ukraine because it was likely to stop you from falling for fascist propaganda.
Yes.
That was a unique way to kind of see the effects of gardening and the fact that you would be able to independently arrive at your conclusions and be less susceptible.
Well, he was pro-Russia and anti-Kiev government.
Okay.
But because there was a counter-argument to that as well. But,
okay.
Yeah.
But it's a notion. Notionally, it sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Lalage.
you, thank you.
You got it right, didn't I?
Yeah.
And what a remarkable book. Thank you
Thanks
very, very
much.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.